Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Welcome. Thank you for being here. It's a snowy day, and I know there's lots of weather that's keeping people from getting here in person, but we do have about 40 people on Zoom right now, as well as people in the room, including one of our panelists who is unable to join us in person because of airline delays. One of the things I think about a lot when I'm an institute director and I plan events is, sometimes I get really caught up in like how many people are in the room. And what I've realized the more I've done this is it doesn't really matter how many people are in the room. It's who's in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And who's committed to being here and who's in this space about racial justice. So I'm really honored to be here on a Friday afternoon where the snow is coming down. And there are people who don't live here and who don't work here, who have driven or flown and tried in every possible way to get here, and students who have walked, without cars to be here. So I'm just really grateful for us all holding this space. And before I get to a little bit of the introductions, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. So just a couple moments, we would like to acknowledge the Kroc Institute's presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Powhatan and Potawatomi, who have been in relationship with this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the story and practices of colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond the gesture of this land acknowledgement. We must also reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. We also note that a land acknowledgement alone would be meaningless if it were not accompanied by active work to address the structural injustice and violence perpetuated against Indigenous people around the globe. Both historically and currently, the Kroc Institute is committed to working to address these harms and to find ways to contribute to constructive transformation through our teaching, research, and peace-building efforts. And so it's with my great pleasure that I get to introduce this panel today. My name is Erin Corcoran. I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and I'm also a member of the faculty of the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I think, Gwendolyn and I decided, Dr. P and I decided that we should call this a panel 2.0, because last year we did this panel it was entitled "Walking the Spirit of Truth: Charting the Pathways to Racial Injustice," and it was, it was really your vision that brought us to do this and to discuss, racial justice and conflict transformation, and to be part of the Walk the Walk week that Notre Dame has. And I do want to say, like, for someone who's been at Notre Dame for about 6 years now, until 2 years ago, on Martin Luther King Day, Notre Dame still held classes. They had a lunch, but it was not a holiday. It was not a university holiday. And that's changed in the last couple of years. And that's, I think, a really good step forward, and a really important step. So, we want to be part of those conversations around this week. But it's not just about this week, right? It's about, how we see our work and our research and our passions, thinking about these issues that are really complicated and hard, in a space where we can kind of move forward and have really robust conversation. So I'm just really excited that we're here again this year together with the speakers that we had last year, who had some really reflective insights and thoughts, and I think really pushed us to think differently about our roles in this world, in this space. So what I'm going to do, just as a format, is I'm going to introduce Gwendolyn Purfoy, who's Dr. Gwendolyn Purfoy, who's the Assistant Professor of Racial Justice and Conflict Transformation here at the Kroc Institute. One of my colleagues who I really have enjoyed getting to know. And she's going to moderate the panel and also was instrumental in giving us advice about who we might bring and invite to be part of the conversation outside of Notre Dame. And so she's going to introduce those people. But I want to tell you a little about her because, well, I think she's kind of cool.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Yeah. So, you know, her areas of expertise range between race and place, the built environment, urban sociology, ethnographic methods, and visual sociology. You know, and her current title here is the Assistant Professor of Racial Justice and Conflict Transformation at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And she's part of our core faculty here at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Because one of the things we thought a lot about doing in our last strategic plan, or thinking about doing more going forward, is, you know, international peace isn't just about international peace across another ocean, right? We got to think about what it means within our own borders. We're part of the global community. We're part of the problems and the solutions. And we have a history in ways that are, not very beautiful, or, that I would not necessarily be proud of as this country, of how we've treated people coming from ethnic minorities. You know, a lot of my work is in the migration space and in immigration. But we have a lot of reconciling to do with slavery, with how people of color have been treated and continue to be treated. And so I think it's really great that the Kroc Institute is investing resources and bringing an esteemed faculty member like Dr. Porfoy to here. But that's just the beginning. You know, we have more work to do. And so I'm really excited that she's here, and is a core member of our faculty. She's also a faculty fellow at the Keough School's Kroc Institute for Civil and Human Rights. And what I think is really interesting about her work is that she focuses on how material infrastructures, transportation systems, spatiality shape the experiences of racially and class marginalized individuals and communities. So she's an ethnic ethnographer. How do you say that? Ethnographer. Yeah, thank you. And in that capacity has spent several years conducting extensive fieldwork in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Newark, where she examines the lived experiences of Black and Brown folks in public places and neighborhoods. In the fall of 2022, she was awarded a visiting faculty fellowship at Brown University Center for Race and Ethnicity in America. And that's kind of a big deal. To research how Blacks are experiencing the current redevelopment boom in Newark after decades of widespread systemic racism and disinvestment. Her first book, Race in Motion, Public Transportation and Restricted Mobility Spaces, uses ethnographic and archival data to examine how public transportation is used to support persistent inequalities that are raced, spatial, material, social, and embodied. This book presents research that shows that although some may think that public transportation exemplifies race progress in the United States, after all, Blacks no longer have to sit in the back of the bus. They may not be able to find a bus. Public transportation continues to be a separate and unequal experience. And before she came to Notre Dame, she was an associate professor at North Park University, and she earned her PhD in sociology from the Loyola University of Chicago. And in addition to her academic research, she works directly with community organizations, regional planning agencies, including the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Regional Transportation Authority. She's the current member of the advisory board for the City of Chicago's UN Safe Cities Project, where she provides expertise as a member of the Gender-Based Violence Research Advisory Group. And she's also a really terrific colleague. And I'm really, really pleased to have her on the faculty with me. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. P.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you all for braving the weather. And for those who are online. So a couple, and I'm sorry, I have to have my phone out because one of our speakers is on his way and other people are texting me. And last year I missed some important messages. So it's not that I'm ignoring y'all or the panelists, but occasionally I have to look down at my phone. So before I introduce the panelists, I do want to call our attention to a few things. I want to thank Kroc and Aaron and everyone who helped to make this possible. I want to give thanks to Jen O'Brien and to Ari Woodward for really putting all this together for us and all the logistics that went along with it. To all of those who are online, including Dr. Hewitt, who I'll introduce in a minute. But I also want to bring your attention to this beautiful painting that is in front of us that was done by an artist. Her name is Eunice Harris, also known as Eunice Harris Scarver. She is a Black artist and also a Christian artist as well. And it's, you know, in getting into the art field as Black women is an area of exclusion, as we know. So I wanted to, and she painted this as a gift to me. So I was like, you know, because she had made me this beautiful gift some years ago, and it got ruined in a flood. And then she surprised me with this one. So I was like, it was perfect. I have the perfect picture for us to display. So now let me introduce our fantastic panelists to you. I'm going to begin here with Dr. Derek R. Brooms, who is the inaugural Executive Director of the Black Men's Research Institute and Professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College, which is an HBCU that is in Atlanta. That's Historically Black College and University, for those who don't know. He also serves as a youth worker and is an award-winning educator and scholar. His research primarily centers on the lived experiences of Black boys and men, with a particular focus on their pathways to and through a life. But more broadly, his work focuses on educational equity, racial justice, and representation. And that's not even like but a small snippet, because we ain't getting into all the books that he's written and all the articles that he's written. One of his newer ones, The Stakes is High, and it's great. If it's not on your reading list, put that on your reading list. Also, next to him is Dr. Carla Gore, who is a professor of sociology and the director of the Anti-Racism and Equity Institute at Kent State University. As the director of the Racism and Equity Institute, Dr. Gore focuses on supporting rigorous and accessible research and creating collaborative opportunities between departments, colleges, and community partners, so that is very important. Her research uses experimental methodologies to examine the ways that racial power and prestige affect dynamics in small groups. A central theme in her research is the examination of the ways in which inequality is negotiated, challenged, and perpetuated by individuals who occupy different spaces in the racial hierarchy. Online and waving to you from DC is Dr. Amber Hewitt, and she is the inaugural Chief Equity Officer for the District of Columbia government and the Director of the Mayor's Office of Racial Equity. In this role, Dr. Hewitt advises Mayor Bowser on policy decisions and works in collaboration with the district leadership and agencies to apply a racial equity lens across government's operations. Dr. Hewitt also served as the Director of Health Equity for a national health advocacy organization and Health Policy Fellow in the office of U.S. Senator Cory Booker. Dr. Hewitt also currently continues to teach, even though she has a full-time job, at Simmons University, where she teaches courses on social policy and macro social work. And he will eventually be in the room, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce him now, would be Dr. David Stovall, a professor in the Department of Black Studies and in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research interests include critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work manifests itself in his involvement with a collection of classroom teachers and community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and also in Los Angeles. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also serves as a volunteer for various youth organizations as well. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, our esteemed panelists, and we are going to get started. Of course, my computer decided to black out while I was standing up there, so just give me one moment, and so we will of course have time for questions, and we want to make sure that we leave ample time for the questions so that you're a part of the discussion, and that includes for those who are also attending online. They will share your questions with us. So I want to begin with the fact that we're having the conference. It's 2024, and this country been around for a minute, right? And yeah, but I feel like we have the same conversation year after year after year after year after year after year. And part of it is the United States seems to not be able to reconcile its racist history, right, and present, right, because it ain't all in the past. People like to say, okay, it's really in the past, but we know that it's not. Everyday stories of racism and racial violence. And before I pose the question to the panel, I want you to think about racism as an embodied experience. That how we know from various forms of research that racism actually impacts health and health outcomes for people of color. For instance, research tells us that it's harder for Black women, professional Black women, to even carry their babies to term compared to white women who don't even have a high school diploma because of the everyday experiences of racism and how it gets in the body. So to my esteemed panelists, my question is, how do you think, like all the things that we've learned and we know about racism, how did the United States, you think, became a nation where its people still continue to be touchy and uncomfortable, talking about the realities of race and the realities of racism, especially in open forums like this, where our nation has been utilized as a model for eugenics and other types of racist projects across the world. So I don't know who wants to begin. And Dr. Hewitt, when you're ready to speak, if you raise your hand, we'll know you're ready. So I don't know who wants to start off with that question. And I know it's a loaded question, but
So loaded.
we got a few sociologists on the panel, so I think they can handle that as well as a psychologist. So
Well, okay, I'll just start
All right.
just quickly. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here and braving the weather. And thank you, Gwen, for having us again. It's great to all be together. David's on his way. So I think part of the reason it's so hard to talk about race, and I've been teaching for about 25 years, and I have found that throughout all of my years of teaching undergraduate and graduate students, that there is something about talking about race in particular that feels different than when we talk about other forms of inequality. I think part of it is the idea of the way race has been defined and used in this country flies in the face of deeply held nationalistic values that we have. So things like democracy and freedom, things like equality and individualism. These are things that we learn about when we're young, and we hear about them throughout our entire lifetimes. So for instance, if you were anything like me, I can't tell you how many adults when I was a child said to me things like, you can be anything you want to be. Has anyone had that experience? There's nothing you can't do if you just believe in yourself and try hard enough and never give up and work really hard. Then the world is your oyster. The world is open to you. What we know, though, is because of the way that racism works, is that is not true, that racism limits opportunities and life chances of entire groups of people, regardless of how smart you are, how ambitious you are, how much you try, how persistent you are, that there are things that racism is something that will limit you. We have a hard time talking about that. the reality of that. And we also have a hard time talking about how individuals, how racism, while it truncates the opportunities that some folks have, it actually creates opportunities and clears the pathway for others. So that happens simultaneously. So racism limits some, but creates opportunities for others. That's something that's very hard, particularly for those for whom opportunities are created. It's something that's very hard to talk about. It feels very threatening. It feels insurmountable. It feels like this is a benefit that I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want it to go away. It's something that that could benefit me, or maybe has benefited me throughout my lifetime. It's something I can count on. And so I think this is something that's really hard to talk about. So I think individually people that's something that folks can sort of bank on again and count on. And when we talk about racism systemically, and as a sociologist, I'm much more sort of interested in how we look at systemic issues of inequality. That's something that we've never really been able to talk about in a sustainable way. And when we think back to, we were talking earlier about the summer of 2020, Floyd summer, right? The summer that George Floyd was murdered, the summer that we were dealing with disproportionate deaths from COVID in communities of color. And we were able to sort of turn a lens onto racial inequity in a way that we hadn't in a long time, really since the civil rights movement. So we talked about sort of that moment in time, and the window sort of has closed on that, but we talked about that moment when many people in the country were focused on issues of systemic inequality, sort of the ideas that came out of that never really came to fruition. So lots of different corporations created DEI offices, lots of different universities, including my own, created new offices that dealt with issues of social justice, particularly in terms of racism. And we've seen that sort of fizzle away. So one of the questions I think that's important is, why is it hard for us to talk about race? And when we do talk about race, when events do arise that capture our attention and capture movement, why can't we sustain those? Why can't those things be sustained over time?
Thank you, Dr. Gore. Dr. Hewitt?
Well, first, good afternoon. I wish I could be with you all in person, but glad that I can be with you all virtually. So Dr. P and others, just thank you so much for all the coordination. I just want to emphasize one of Dr. Gore's points around how racism impacts the distributions of both benefits and burdens. And I think that's just a key piece, and I encourage you to sort of hold that as we go throughout the conversation. I'm also going to build on one of her points around the systemic nature of racism, how it isn't just individual, how it's baked into our systems. One example is through policies. So I'm going to start with the policy perspective to answer that question, and then I'll shift to the psychological perspective. I'm reminded of a well-known phrase that has been in the media recently, that's from the Declaration of Independence, that reads that, all men are created equal, which we know was never intended for people who weren't white. So fast forward from 1776 to 1787, when you have the 3/5 compromise, which was only created for Southern states to have even greater representation in Congress. So those are only two of the countless sort of policy examples that highlight the ways that the US government upheld and unjust and racist policies. And we know that those policies still have a direct impact today. And Dr. P, you mentioned that racism is an embodied experience. I would also argue that it's a form of psychological warfare, which means that it influences our opinions, our emotions, attitudes, and behaviors. And many of us have heard the phrase that the truth hurts. I would say that a more accurate way of saying that is the truth makes us confront something that which we've been in denial. And it reminds me of another quote by a writer, Austin Channing Brown. If you haven't checked out her work, I would encourage you to do so. And a quote that often resonates with me is that our only chance at dismantling racial injustice is being more curious about its origins than we're worried about our own comfort.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
Peace. So good afternoon. I'm jumping in here. I wanted to acknowledge IT and give thanks for having Dr. Hewitt still join us. We miss you in person, but so glad that we have you in the space with us. And I echo the gratitude for you all showing up on a nice, mild Midwestern January day. I'm from Chicago, so that's the context. That's the context of my joke. Even though I just came from Atlanta, it was 40 degrees, and you thought that it was freezing over. So, I wanna offer a few thoughts, and I wanna not run the risk of repeating what my colleagues have said. I've got a bunch of notes. Not that any of it makes sense in its own, but because I'm just thinking and processing. I wanna say a couple of things to start, right? So I wanna begin with acknowledging Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia Bailey, right? And for those who don't know, she passed by suicide earlier this month because of a toxic workplace, right? And I wanna go back to the fall to acknowledge Joanne Epps, previous president at Temple University, as well as Dr. Orinthia Monte, previous president at Volunteer State Community College in Tennessee. Both of them passed away in the fall. And I don't really have the time or all of the information to detail all of what has happened, but I want to offer those three women's untimely passings to anchor the point that racism is an embodied experience, right? And what I want to offer is we can talk about racism, and I want to make sure that we amplify anti-Black racism, right? Because in this country, racism is both not neutral and it doesn't impact people the same way, right? Because of our histories, plural, there's some very particular ways that policies, legislation, laws, and practices impact different racial and ethnic groups differentially that is also couched in history. You'll probably hear me with some Audre Lorde, Nikki Giovanni, Ida B. Wells, Barnett, Sonia Sanchez, because I think we need to pay more attention to Black women. There are ways that Black women experience this space, this experiment that we call the United States, that can be very different than many of us, especially given that we live in, as Bell Hooks would say, white supremacist, patriarchal country. So I'll start with this to respond to a part of that question. Ever since the birth of this nation, white America has had a schizophrenic personality on the question of race. That's Dr. King, right? So when we think about what are some of our challenges in understanding or having conversations about race, I think it's, from a James Baldwin type of perspective, we don't want to know what we don't want to know, right? We want to believe, as my colleagues have said, that the narrative and the rhetoric that we offer about who we are is what it is, even though we have lived experiences in this country that will both deny and defile those claimed truths. And so it's very difficult to think about why it's not difficult, I'm sorry. It's very challenging, our reluctance and unwillingness to engage in conversations, not just with terms, because race and racism are not just words that we use, they carry weight, right? They signify a history. They reflect lived experiences. And so as I was writing some notes earlier, and even when Dr. Gore was talking, I wrote a few more notes. I'm just thinking about how I learned about race and racism from my own family growing up in one of the most racially, residentially segregated cities in this country, where I understood very early on, there were some things that people in my family, because they were racialized as Black, both could not do and were not expected to do, right? So I listened to my grandfather, who's from North Little Rock, Arkansas, tell stories about growing up and he had to get off the sidewalk when other white folks were on the sidewalk, right? You can't turn that off. And he hadn't lived in North Little Rock for 50 some odd years, but he carried that with him, right? And so in some ways, not in some ways, in many ways, I really want to articulate that racism is violence, right? And if we treat it as just words and people feeling uncomfortable, then we have completely ignored the adverse and negative impact that it has on people's lived experiences, right? We can talk about infant mortality rates. We can talk about Black women's maternal health and reproductive rights. We can talk about the Tuskegee experiment. We can talk about Sandra Bland. We can give names on and on and on. And to me, for me, all of that is evidence of the racial inequities that we continue to experience in this country, that not only do folks not want to acknowledge, they also want to deny, right? And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating is that in this country, when you share about your racialized experiences, people are very quick to tell you, you shouldn't make everything about race. What are we really saying? I'm just asking rhetorical questions because I don't have I have some thoughts about that, but I don't claim to have answers, right? But when I take that, right, I have to take it very seriously because partially what we're communicating to each other is you don't have the right to talk about your experiences in a racialized lens because I don't want to hear it. And what that then does is it creates these dynamics where people may internalize their struggles and then they begin to question, did I get treated that way because I'm, racialized as Black? And we begin to internalize that. So in fact, if you look at scientific data, they will be able to detail that racism actually impacts people physiologically, right? I'm talking about cortisone levels, right? Blood pressure and stress. And so in some ways, it's not necessarily silent, but we think about racism as this silent killer, right? It's actually killing us. Or as the Fugees might say, killing us softly. I digress. So two other points here. I'm thinking about a previous institution that I worked at, and I was hired to teach my kind of teaching responsibilities were race and theory. And I had a colleague who was teaching this race class in between the time that somebody else stopped teaching and between the time that I got hired. And I remember one of the very first conversations, this individual said to me that they really were happy not to have to teach the race class because it's so hard, right? And I think about that. I carry that with me today. That was over 10 years ago. I think about that for a couple of different reasons, especially given the current socio-political cultural context that we're in right now, where we have states banning books, right? Banning critical race theory in a bastardized way that ain't even about critical race theory. I would argue is the backlash to the summer of 2020, because we don't really necessarily teach critical race theory to undergraduates in high school, et cetera. And we can circle back to that. But I think about, these difficulties. And so for that person, based on their own social identities and social backgrounds, it could be hard because maybe it's beyond their level of real expertise, right? I can read some articles and study some stuff and I can teach it, but there's some dynamics of teaching this that I don't necessarily feel comfortable with. I think there are some ways that we might teach a subject, including race and racism, that students may be uncomfortable with because depending on their background and their lived experiences, maybe they've actually never had to have those conversations. Right? And I think both of those can be true. My issue is it's hard to live with racism. Right? And so it's easy and as privileged as it is to say, I don't want to teach that. What do we tell to the people that they have to live it every day? Right? What does it mean when you're in particular neighborhoods? We have young Black children in particular neighborhoods and they're being questioned and surveilled and policed and asked questions. What are you doing here? So as much as we don't want to talk about race, race colors and marks so many of our interactions that we are unwilling to acknowledge. And in that way, because of our stubborn, I would argue, stubborn unwillingness and really calculated investment and desire of it to quote unquote go away, we wouldn't question students on things like I was working at I've taught in high school, I've taught in the community, I've taught in community college, and I've taught at research institutions. And in teaching at a high school, there was a staff member questioning Black students on why would you want to go to a Black college? And again, we don't ask white students, why do you want to go to a white college, right? Right? We ask questions, why do the Black kids sit at the cafeteria table, as Beverly Tatum's book, right? Mm-hmm. We don't ask white kids, why y'all sit at the cafeteria table together? So what happens is that we are very aware of the other, right? And the clustering, but we don't question the clustering when it's folks who look like us, right? And so that then kind of builds into these unwillingness to have what I would call very honest conversations. Why are you uncomfortable? And we're not willing to ask that question. We're not going to make very much progress because we continue to actually lie to ourselves.
Thank you. All right, so they touched on this a little bit, but I want us to get a little bit deeper into the weeds on this. So summer of 2020, right? COVID's running rampant through the United States. And also other people started running rampant through the United States, right? Running and walking and marching. And we had this whole like racial justice thing, not just happening in the US, but happening all over the world. Now, in the United States, there's a couple of things that, that are big deal, like, exercise, Peloton got big during, that time, right? And Noom and Go Low, right? Like and all these different things, telehealth, like all these responses to people's health and ways of living, right? And all these different mechanisms to move people to being healthier mentally and healthier physically. And then some institutions began to try to, like, how do we become healthier socially and institutionally, especially when it comes to race? So as Dr. Gore and Dr. Brum pointed out, and also we know that this is the job that Dr. Hewitt has, started dealing with diversity, right? Programs in a more intentional way or broader way with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. That was in 2020. We're only in 2024. And there have been laws passed that say you can't do it. There's been backlash. We haven't even done it a good minute. That's what he said. Can we get 5 years? Right? I'm giving that to go after 400 years. Right? Can't even get that. So panelists, what I want you to know, like, how do we respond to the US's, you coming in at the perfect time, Dr. Stonewall.
There it is.
Let's welcome Dr. Stonewall in. He made sure he was gonna make it for y'all today. So this, I can't say that the US don't have good memory, right? So we're seeing curriculum being attacked that deals with the truth about, no, let me rephrase that. US history books have never been accurate, right? They've never told the full story, right? We get this single-sided story. We get words used about indigenous populations that really were the Europeans that were carrying out, like savages, right? That's really for Europeans, but it was placed upon the bodies of indigenous populations. So our books and our education have never been accurate, but now there's a more even more say public-facing, bold attempts to make them even less accurate. This movement to try to erase, because history is what it is, but to restructure how we're teaching US education and history that even further sanitizes, whitewashes history, denies racism itself. And I believe that part of it is it's in direct response to what people saw 2020, because Black folks been marching for a minute, right? That wasn't new. What was new were the places and the people who were in these marches. When white teenagers and white young folks started coming out, which they've been in marches for years, right? But not in this massive number and not in these small towns. Like, I have a place scholar, so I pay attention to when new things happen in places. And the visuals of seeing middle and upper class white youth out there marching in thousands, and both in rural America and in urban America, it freaked people out. We can pretend like it didn't, but we're seeing the consequences of it. How do we respond to that at an individual level, but also as a collective, to this attack on trying to have some sort of racial reckoning and reconciliation here in America, when the little bit that was tried to be done has been on attack, and some of it has already been wiped away, and we're not even at 5-year mark, right? We ain't gonna even get into affirmative action, all that other good stuff, right? So y'all, yeah, so go ahead, whoever wants to go first.
So I think,
Oh, please.
No, we're gonna pass the mic to you. We're gonna let you just really warm on up and just, come in and jump in. That, we do double dutch. Just go ahead and jump on
Right,
in.
just don't dig your potatoes.
Right.
Well, again, thank y'all. All apologies for my tardiness. A little bit of whiteout conditions on I-80, so it's a little funky. And that was, but Chicago gets through. I think it's important, Dr. Purifoyer, to put in the context of the United States, and we make a tragic mistake in the United States. We first make the mistake that this is a place founded on equitable anything,
Right.
right? I mean, like this is, so the events or what have you, post 2020, I mean, this is a land founded on enslavement, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. Period. We don't have to go back and forth with folks around that. I mean, I think that when you understand that to be the baseline, then you actually expect those things that we see to be happening, right? So if you are founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation, then you are expectant of people to actually go back to the thing that kept them in power, right? So I would encourage folks to read the work of somebody named Christopher Rufo. He lays out the plan for this, right? He talks about 2020 being this fear moment. And he said, look, if this goes a particular way, there's nothing we can do to reverse it. So now we have to engage in a political, economic, and financial campaign to actually dethrone this, right? And he was very clear about what it would take. So if we think about things like critical race theory, Rufo was clear about that. He says, I don't need for one human on this planet Earth to understand what critical race theory is.
Oh, no, not at all.
I just need you to associate it with the craziest thing you can think about. So now anytime it comes up, there's never a conversation because it's the craziest thing you've ever thought about, right? So now he's asking, and he talked about how he engineered this. So now when we think about US history or social studies in classroom space, this has always been the issue. As a social studies educator, I would always tell my high schoolers, this is intended to bore the shit out of you, right? This is the job of social studies. So now, what do we do knowing that to be true, right? So now when we think about this moment, how are we steeped in resistance, and how do we actually pull from those historical markers that tell us what it is that we need to do? And, it's not around, because I think in other spaces, people get paranoid in opposed to being pushed into action, right? So when folks get paranoid about things, there's a tendency to freeze up. But what we're saying is now you have to think about, I would only expect Christopher Rufo to lay out his plan. I would only expect Donald J. Trump to actually run and then win and then want to stay in forever. Welcome to the United States. We thought something was different. So this thing around really being clear, or I think this is the moment where we can be clear about what it is that we're in. We can be clear that the United States constantly reminds us what it has always been. And now we have a different set of work that calls us to pull on history and the people who have resisted, right? Because it's not to get us into paralysis, but it's to actually say there is something that can be done, but we have to be wholehearted in what it is that we do to make sure that we're doing that thing in a myriad of spaces, right? Healthcare, education, employment, higher ed, right? So however it is that we think about this thing, we gotta be clear around this is nothing new and we should not be shocked by it.
I agree. Carol Anderson wrote a book called White Rage, right? And in that book, she talks about sort of what happens when Black Americans begin to make any sort of social progress. And she starts back at Reconstruction, right? And the story is whenever there's any sort of racial progress, there's this rage, there's this white resistance that pushes back. So this is not new. What we are seeing, sort of the resistance against CRT, the book banning, things like Senate Bill 83 in Ohio, the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. These things are not new, even though it feels so big and so insurmountable. But this is just the resistance, right? So you're right, we should have expected this. And whenever there's any sort of progress made, Floyd Summer, there was progress made. People were marching in the streets demanding racial equity. So of course we're going to see this sort of resistance, this sort of pushback. So even though it feels awful and huge, it's time, I agree, to be brave and to be bold and to be wise, right? Understanding that this was expected and sort of coming up with ways to pivot around this type of resistance and pivot around the sorts of things that are coming down.
I think I'm gonna jump in before, I think Dr. Hewitt might have something, but I'm gonna jump in real quick. Cause Brother Stovall always just bring a different level to this. I think one of the things is that we really have to pay attention to is that, to your point, Dr. Gore, whenever there's progress, there's resistance. There's always resistance to progress as it relates to equity and equality in this country. There's never been a decade where folks weren't trying to create greater inequities, right? So if we start from that premise, it actually shouldn't be surprising that a response to the demands for greater racial equity, one of the responses is we need to stop teaching some of our kids some things in school. I just want to make sure y'all hear that, right? Like we want to make sure, because again, that there's also some quote unquote anti-woke legislation. Because I mean, I've been in a lot of places, but I ain't never heard nobody get up and say I'm woke. Like I mean, you just, but it's the rhetoric, right? That people use to galvanize support on something that they didn't even know that they would support. So one of the real easy examples for me, I mean, you didn't ask about book bans, but I got a lot of stuff to say now, but I'm gonna mind my time because I know Dr. Hewitt wants. But I'm thinking about Amanda Gorman, who gave the poem at the Biden inauguration. There was a parent in the state of Florida who led a petition to ban her poetry book. And somebody later asked, well, what did you find about the book that was really problematic? I don't know, I ain't never read it. It's laughable, but in some kind of way, she galvanized people to support it, right? And so what's a real kind of, reality in this country is I kind of, in a sense, I don't want to support nothing if it ain't gonna help me, right? So one of the real issues we have to deal with in this country is this notion that equity and equality means some folks got to lose some things. And we want to talk about what a problem is. That's a problem, right? Because really what privilege is, I ain't trying to, look, I know male privilege, right? Privilege ain't just racial. There are men who don't want to give up their male privilege because they feel like I'm going to lose something. And when you tie your identity to what that privilege allows you, ain't no way I'm going back, right? And so it's not necessarily surprising to me because I think about history, Howard Zinn, history is a weapon, right? So if you want to, if we think about the civil rights movement, one of the things that kind of gets lost, we don't really teach it well, but one of the things that get lost is that the most ardent force in the civil rights movement was young people. And it also happened to be young people who were studying where? At HBCUs. Because they're getting a different kind of education that's built on the reality of their lived experiences when they go back home, wherever that home may be. And so if you want to retard a movement, you make sure that folks ain't got access to the same types of information, right? So I think that's something that we really, really got to pay attention to because, when we look at bills that have been passed in Texas and Florida, what was the thing that came out from DeSantis, the AP Afro American class has no, quote, no educational value. When did Ron DeSantis ever understand what was the educational value in African American studies? Never. But in this country, you don't have to. If you can galvanize people's fears, right? One last point, I think about this because I teach high school history. We need to change the curriculum, particularly in high school, and really not teach things about race and the history of our country with enslavement, indigenous extermination, et cetera, because it's going to make white children feel bad.
Right. Look at that.
We politic in education based on the comfort of white students.
Right.
And my question, again, is rhetorical. What is the message to students of color?
Mhm.
Your comfort is never our concern. Your experiences don't matter, and we don't want your truths. So if we don't want to teach you those things, ain't no way we're gonna have a conversation.
Dr. Hewitt, thank you.
Sure, I can jump in briefly. Dr. Stovall, great to see you. Wish I could be there in person. So I wanted to build off something that Dr. Broom said that, I often hear around when we talk about equity and justice, that it sort of evokes the sense of feeling like someone is losing something. And what's driving these attacks are, that feeling of being threatened. So I just really wanted to highlight that point. And I think another point that Dr. Broom's sort of mentioned is that sort of only, if you're targeting equity initiatives in one way that folks are losing, but we're all losing. And I think a point that is missing in the response is going beyond sort of the moral imperative and sort of speaking in the language that the United States understands, which is around money and currency, which is the fiscal imperative. So thinking about what we're losing for the cost of racism. There was a recent report by NPR that gave sort of 4 points that I just wanted to share with you because I think they're really sort of astonishing just to think about sort of the economic impacts and the economic cost of racism on the US economy. So for example, $13 trillion lost in potential business revenue because of discriminatory lending practices to Black entrepreneurs, 2.7 trillion in income loss because of disparities in wages suffered by Black Americans, $218 billion lost over the past 2 decades because of discrimination in providing housing credit, and 90 billion to 113 billion in lifetime income loss from discrimination in accessing higher education. So we're thinking about our response, also thinking about pairing both the moral imperative and the fiscal imperative.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewitt. So this is probably our last question before we take questions from the audience. And I'm trying to figure, so let me read a couple of scriptures to y'all, because that's what I do. Right.
Well,
So I'm gonna go to Proverbs first, which says in Proverbs 21:3, and I'm reading from the King James Version, to do justice and judgment is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. That means, go ahead and sacrifice that privilege to do justice, in case you didn't know what it meant, what Solomon was saying. Okay. Then I want to go to 2 Timothy 4:3. And I'm an elder and evangelist, so that's how I know the word of God well. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall, and this gets to what the panelists have been saying, but after their own lusts shall heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. So I'm saying again, this word of God, okay? And they shall turn away, capital G-O-D, right? And they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. So when we think about talking about racism, and this is a Catholic institution, but just thinking about these scriptures and doing justice, why does it become even more important, right? And the Bible is prophetic, right? But more important to keep pushing for truth to be told, keep pushing for justice to be told, especially when it comes to race, while at the same time, folks asking you why you so angry. But they don't talk about the anger that they have about their white privilege and possibly losing it and all of their advantages, because anger is often used in conversations against anything that has to do with racial justice. Racial justice has to exist because racial injustice was created, right? We wouldn't have to fight for racial justice had you not created racial injustice and all the things that go along with it. But why is it important that we continue to push for truth, even as laws are being created, even as economic systems are being used to continue to oppress and suppress and to regress as well? I know that was loaded, y'all, but go for it.
And thank you so much for the word, because that is, and I think about a political writer by the name of Dennis Rorty, and he wrote a book in the late 90s called Achieving Our Country. And in Achieving Our Country, he has this description of what he refers to as the strong man. And he said, this is a person who does not actually adhere to fact. This is a person, and it's so wild. I mean, he wrote this in the 90s. He said, this is a person who will be imbued in court cases. This is a person who will also deeply galvanize those who have already been lied to believe his lies further, right? I mean, he lays it out, right? And he talked about the strong man coming because of the response to perceived racial, social, and other economic advances, right? So this thing around putting it into a larger conversation, right? And this, I've been struggling, it's so good to see y'all. I've been struggling with this for a little bit because I actually gave this to my students yesterday. There is a movie, it is a documentary by the name of Time is Illmatic, and it's about the MC by the name of Nas, whose name is Nasir Jones. His father is a jazz musician named Olu Dara. Olu Dara says when Nas and his younger brother were 12 and 13, an assistant principal and a math teacher sat Mr. Dara down and said, this place is not good for them. There's not the things that they need in this place. Mr. Dara went back to his two sons, and I want y'all to think about this. This is a Black man sitting down with a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old, and he tells them, leave school if you want to save your life. Like, and all my students were like, oh, right? Everybody's going, oh, right? And I said, well, what would you all say if a parent told you that? And I love the answer of one of my students. She said, well, first, I wouldn't believe them. Right? So this thing around, we're in this moment, right? When we have to question these things that we think to be right and good, and now say, well, what's the purpose here? Why do they exist? What have they been engineered to do?
That's right.
Right? And now when you actually come from that space, and that thing still rings in my head from 11 years ago when I first saw Time is Illmatic. I just kept saying to myself, leave school if you want to save your life, right? Because now we're in this moment where we're asking these questions that got very simple, but often difficult answers, right? And this is the thing around where will you, because again, I'm saying school, understanding that that's very different from education, right? So this thing around how are we making a tangible decision around what will educate us, what will allow us to make informed decisions based on this thing that is now turning us into a space, and Doc, as you read the word, to turn our ears and backs to sting us, right? So now we have to think about, well, what is it that we're in, right? And what processes do we use to lift the veil, right? And what happens when the veil is lifted and now those fake folks who have been, the veil has been lifted for, are also mad as hell, right? How do we direct the energy into spaces that make sense, right? Because it's, coming from Chicago, we know very clearly, and even here in South Bend, y'all got this thing, South Bend likes to hide stuff. Y'all do this thing. This is an interesting thing about South Bend. First, you would not know from anywhere on the planet there was as many Black folks as there are in South Bend. There's no way for you to know that.
You gotta go south and
Yeah. You gotta go to South and West and South Bend, right? There's no way for you to know that. But what I do know is very clear, and it made me think about it. This was about 10 years ago. I looked at the suspension and expulsion rates in South Bend. right? There were nothing but Black youth
Yep, yep.
in that space, right? How does 20% of the district account for almost 90% of the suspensions and expulsions? Right? That's a structural issue, right? And now we have to think about what that means moving forward, right? So now I see the folks who are on the margins, like Dr. King said, as key to the victory condition, not the ones who would be further marginalized, but your victory and justice comes by way of those who are on the margins. If you do nothing for them,
That's right.
you have no justice. And I think it's really important as we start to think about this very practically. And as November approaches, we see some things coming in real focus, right? Not to ignore that, but to go into it, not to be paranoid, but to now say, it's here, right? What are you going to do? Why are you going to do it? And who are you going to do it with? Right? And I say those as questions, not that I'm asking you all, but the same questions that I'm asking myself, right? Because this is, again, justice is lived, it's delivered, it is grown, it is pervaded. So now, what is that justice condition as determined by the people, as Dr. Purfoy said, who have experienced the injustice?
Thank you.
And others? Dr. Hewitt?
Yes, I can jump in. Hopefully I can build off of what Dr. Stovall mentioned, but I want to point to part of the university's mission and to tie it to the question. So part of the university's mission states that its goal is to cultivate in its students a disciplined sensibility to the poverty, injustice, and oppression that burden the lives of so many. And it goes on to state that the aim is to create a sense of human solidarity and concern for the common good that will bear fruit as learning becomes service to justice. So if Notre Dame wants to live up to its mission or continue living up to its mission, then like Dr. Stovall mentioned, faculty and staff must be justice seekers. And as a Christian university, going back to what was previously said about focusing on those in the margins, thinking about Jesus as embodying that and doing that, and aligning himself with those who experience great oppression and injustice. And I think also having a justice perspective requires us to sort of acknowledge those hard or simple yet hard truths and understand our racial history. And I think it also requires us to be about action. So not moving beyond equity to justice, how can we remove the barriers that were created by systemic racism? And I think that ultimately requires us to do what Dr. King called as remaining awake through a great revolution. And with that, we have to accept the hard realities of the truth.
Thank you. Dr. Bloom, Dr. Moore, before we take questions from the audience.
I really appreciate that. I appreciate that we're talking about folks on the margins. I also think that this is a good time to talk about folks who are no longer on the margins, or no longer sort of in marginalized positions. So I'm thinking about, and particularly in the area of higher ed, Black women are ascendant, right? So Black women are making strides in higher ed in a way they never have before. They are encroaching on white space in a way that they never have before. And we are seeing sort of the pushback on that. So I'm thinking about Claudine Gay, right? Who was the most recent past president of Harvard University, and sort of how she was sort of systemically taken down, right? First by, what people thought is not a good showing in front of a Senate hearing, and then calls of plagiarism and so that is, I think, is something that is important to note. So as we focus on issues of anti-Black racism, it's important to talk about folks who were never offered a seat at the table. But I also think it's important to understand how anti-Black racism impacts people who are at the table. The idea that just because you're at the table, like you have not made it, the racism might change, right? It might evolve in the way that it impacts you, but certainly folks at the table are not immune. So I think it's important that we remember that as well.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll say a few things, and I know we want to engage our audience. And I don't know, I got a lot to say, but I'm gonna say it really quickly. So I was thinking about when Brother Stovall was giving that data on Black boys in South Bend. What keeps us committed to telling the truth is because otherwise those would be erased, right? And we know that those stories, and we have data on data. I can think about Black boys in Inglewood, in back of the yard. I can think about, Black boys in Auburn Gresham, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And I think about Black boys in the West End in Louisville, et cetera. In my research, I'm coming from a Black boyhood lens because that's what my research is, right? I'm not, of course, ignoring other folks. And the reason I want to just mention Black boys again, I know Brother Stovall mentioned it, is that because when we look at these statistics and the data on Black boys, one of the problems we have is that people think they know Black boys because they've seen numbers. Teach, right? So we look at the graduation rates of Black men in higher education, those who attend a 4-year institution, their graduation rate over a 6-year period is the lowest among all racial and gender groups. And that typically turns itself into a question of what's wrong with Black men? Why don't they care about education? And part of my work and so many others, I can give you a bunch of names of other folks. The real question is, what's wrong with these schools and their lack of commitment to educating Black men? I'm thinking about scholar James Earl Davis, wrote this in 2003, talking about the early schooling experiences of Black boys. He said, Black boys are both loved and loathed in school, right? So I think about a school like University of Tennessee, that was my previous institution. I think about Notre Dame. Black men are loved when we can go out on the athletic field, right? Part of it now is we making the school so much money, we can't treat them poorly, right? Let's look at the graduation rates. That tells a different story, right? And so part of why we have to stay committed to telling these stories is otherwise our experiences in our lives will, forget being hit, they'll just be marginalized and dismissed. But when I think about like this love and loathe of Black boys, when I think about 20%, again, I can give you data from, I'm thinking about the SHOT report in 2015 when they just lay it out state by state, city by city. And so I think about what Patricia Williams talks about. She wrote this in 1991. She talked about the spirit murder of Black people, right? And we've seen some folks engage with this concept in education research. And part of it is this, in a nutshell is, if you treat people poorly enough, right, you will dwindle their candle, their light, their desire to want to achieve higher than kind of wherever they are. And then you can use a particular narrative and rhetoric and say, see, they just don't care, right? And what that also then is used to justify providing them with less resources and less support, right? And so we can't look at Black men's performance or Black boys' performances educationally and outcomes if we're not willing to ask in what ways are we committed to providing them with the equitable resources in order to be successful. And then just one last point I'm thinking about, I did a lot of study in Mississippi, the Black Freedom Movement, and had a chance to meet with folks who were in the Black Freedom Movement in the 1960s. So I'm particularly thinking about Hollis Watkins, Brother Hollis Watkins, who just passed last year. His picture's actually up in the National Civil Rights Museum. So it was like, I just saw your picture. He taught us freedom songs, right? And he didn't just teach us songs. He talked to us about why they used the songs. And part of that was so that for generations, people could tell those stories and share those stories because, as Langston Hughes tells us, life for me ain't been no crystal stair, right? I don't, many of us come from places where, as James Baldwin said, you have been expected to aspire to mediocrity, right? I can think about my entire 4-block radius when I was growing up. I don't know anybody that went to college. That's not a knock on them. I only went to college because I didn't want to go to the military and I knew I couldn't stay at home. I didn't feel like I had any other options. How do we talk about equity and freedom and you can be anything you want to be when folks go to schools and people are telling them, we got a prison cell waiting for you.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
And so we are much more, too many folks are willing to invest in canceling Black youth's futures as opposed to, providing them with opportunity. So again, if we push the narrative on Black kids that don't care about school, and we actually gender that as really Black boys, given all of the advancements of Black women and Black girls, it becomes easier to believe because we got data that shows it, but we're not asking questions about, what's happening in these schools or what's happening that we see this explosion in imprisonment from the 70s to the early 2000s. And then we say there's something, why are Black men not in their kids' lives? They've been locked up for 20 years. And I'm thinking about people in my family. I ain't talking about like nobody else. And so there are things that Black communities and Black families are suffering from that come from the heels and the boots and the skid marks of racism that is not germane to Black folks. It's really a result of the conditions that we've, been susceptible to, depending on which neighborhoods and communities that we live in. Again, if we're talking about like this anti-Blackness and this real historical and intentional investment in anti-Blackness. So if we don't tell our stories, actually, who's gonna come and tell them for us? All right, thank you.
Can we just mention the name of somebody, and I would encourage folks to look up her name. Her name is Joanne Epps, and I don't think we talk about her enough. Joanne Epps was the president of Temple.
I mentioned that right at the top.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we forget, this is essentially a woman who has died in a early fall convocation,
University function.
On stage.
On stage.
On stage.
And they walk over the warm body and continue the event. I just want folks to really understand that, not just rhetorically, but in the physical world, right?
Hold on, let's make it a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
She collapsed.
Right.
They brought EMS, medical services. They ushered her off. Then they asked another Black woman to come and give her remarks. I just want to make sure we lay it all.
Man, and when we put that in the grand scheme of things, how do we not expect Claudine Gay? Right? I'm still tripping that she read the statement. I was like, don't read that. Don't read that. Right? That's mistake number one. Right? But this thing around you get fooled into believing that these places ever intended to love you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the only ask from an institution is your blood and bone, and then to throw you in the dirt. Right? So this thing around really being very clear about what that justice condition is, because the justice condition says, look, the offering in blood and bone should only be for justice. Right? We have given too much, right, to the places that would rather harm us or kill us, right? And when you say that, I'm always like, look no further than Joanne Epps,
Yep.
right? A warm body on a stage in late summer, and then you ask somebody else who looks just like her to walk over the warm body. Right? So this thing around being very clear about what it is that we're in, right? So there are no misconceptions here, right? Because I think that's often a piece in the justice condition, right? There's the misconception, right? That this thing just happens if you do X, right? You have to be diligent about the work and understanding the relationship to failure and success, not on the terms of white supremacy.
That's right.
Right? So this thing around being very intentional about, because that's different. That's a different way of moving in the work, in opposed to what folks say, 5 people said you wrote a long thing about a little thing, and now congratulations, you're an expert. What?
Right.
Like, what are we talking about? Right? It's insane. Right? So this thing around really being clear about what it is that we're in. But I just want to make sure
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that we,
yeah, yeah.
that we
Appreciate that.
And it's not lost on me that the three people who had to testify were all women.
we're all women,
Right.
period.
We had all these men presidents of universities.
Hella long.
Ain't called none of them men. I just want to point that out.
Right, yeah, I thought the same thing. All right, so we have time for some questions and we can go over a little bit anyway. We'll begin with those in the room and then I think you have a couple of questions online as well. And so Ari's gonna walk around with the mic that you could ask your questions and.
Excuse my seat, but thank you all for your being here. And I'm just very happy with what I'm hearing. I'm looking at myself up there at that table as well one day. I have a master's and I'm wrestling about going for a doctorate, but we can talk about that afterward.
It is.
Dr. Gwendolyn, if I may use your elder name, because I'm an ordained minister myself, and thank you for using the scripture in this meeting, because you can't separate justice from faith.
Come on.
So, don't y'all start with me. I'm gonna go to right now. But a lot of my work when I was an undergrad student here at IU South Bend and then in graduate school in Elkhart, my energy has always been through the church as it comes to justice. The Black church was the foundation of the civil rights movement. What can you all say? Because this continues to be my passion. A lot of folk are saying that the church went silent summer of 2020. And I hosted a panel discussion some time ago with some clergy, and I asked them, what are your thoughts on that 2 or 3 years ago? And I would like to ask the same question to this day. Not to point fingers at the church, I'll say body of Christ or whatever, but when King and all of them spoke, people ran to the church because there was hope there. Today, not knocking Black Lives Matter because I want the energy, but people want to hear what thus saith the Lord concerning injustice, which is where the preacher comes in. What can we say to encourage our churches to say we still need y'all to open that door? And as well, even to our white clergy, where King addressed them in the Birmingham jail letter. So that's my question. I don't know if that's directly to you or if you three want to answer from a historical or whatever perspective or faith background, whatever like that. What is the role of the Christian church today, and have we respect what? How do we keep that voice? That some way argue, we never lost our voice. Okay, how do we keep that?
All right, thank you for that question. Well, you know, like Bishop Barber and there are other pastors and Pastor Moss out of Chicago, Trinity. There are several who continue to do that work. COVID was different situations, but I think something that's different today than it was almost 60 years ago is that we also have white evangelical churches supporting anti-Blackness at the same time. And so you have a schism, right, in the body of Christ. And so I think that's being battled at the same time of trying to uplift and provide justice and encouragement to people who are living in a world where freedom is supposed to be here. I'm thinking of that song, Go Freedom, right? It's supposed to be here. And it's like you're constantly trying to lift, and some things aren't seen as much as others, and it becomes like, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize it visually, or do you prioritize it at the micro level where you're doing the work every day in your church and in your community, because you're also battling hyper incarceration at the same time. You also have prison ministries that didn't exist that are going at the same time. You're also helping, you know, families where the fathers have been locked up at the same time. Some things that don't get the same press as it did when people were going to the church for comfort. And I think that people still go to some extent for, and I think that a lot of that work is being done, but it's work that constantly has to be done, but is not always being showcased, right? Because you have to comfort souls who live in a world that is increasingly hostile towards them. And how do you comfort souls where a world is being increasingly hostile for them while also working in a collective way, right? It's almost like, what do you tend to first? You got to deal with the individual souls, Right, you have to do that, and all at the same time, you also living in that same world that's increasingly hostile
Teach.
towards you, and you're trying to, you got this going here and this going there and that going there, and people disrupting, and folks who are supposed to believe in the same thing you do, saying that because of the color of your skin, kingdom of God is not for you. At the same time, where they may have said it, and of course, they said it 60 years ago, but now they have a platform to say it on social media, on the internet, on the news shows, and creating cable shows where it's non-stop with it. And you have to wrestle with that as men and women of God, while also tending to your flock, while also tending to your community, while also tending to your family at the same time. So I just think it's a different type of work that is being done, because if it's not, we don't have any hope then, right? If that place where solace can be found is not there anymore, and we can see, right, because there's so much that you have to deal with. Many times the churches aren't doing what they want to do, right? But they're doing what they must do at this given time. So yeah, so that's just part of the answer I can provide.
So,
for you.
super quick, get rid of prosperity doctrine, right? And we just gotta be clear about this, right? The solution to joy is not brought by your proximity to capitalism, right? I mean, and that's the assumption, right? I remember, like, and reality TV can just really kind of disturb you in all these different ways, right? I remember there was a show called, it's like Ministers of Detroit or something, right? And a fight almost broke out because this dude was like, we are in Detroit. And you driving up, you pulling up in a Benz? What are we doing? Right? And the false ideology of that, if someone sees me, then they will aspire to do better. What bullshit planet are we on? Right? And this thing around really being clear around, remember the message of that Palestinian that you call Jesus. Right? And remember when he talked about the understanding of those on the margins will now be the ways in which we see light, right? So this thing around being very clear that is a false trope. It will get you into worse things trying to live up to something that was never intended for you, right? And then the other part is, how do we start to talk to young folks in a space of understanding and not admonishment, right? It's a whole thing. And, folks come at me with that. It's like, when young folks come in and the first thing you got to say to them is pull your pants up. Hey,
Ain't got nothing to do with the gospel.
Hey, what are we talking about, right? And we now have to confront. So now if you get rid of prosperity doctrine, now also confront our respectability politics.
That's right.
Right? And that's a tough lesson, right? Because folks look and they feel that things should look a particular way to be understood a certain way, right? And now what young folks are saying, and I appreciate young folks for saying this, they're like, no, we're not doing that, right? We're not doing that. We in a different direction, right? And you are going to make the decision that you either going to be with us or you're going to demonstrate how much you are still the enemy, right? And we got something for the enemy, right? And I think that thing around, and people fear that in opposed to understanding that I think about that as very informed and educated decisions, right? So now, if we take that and say, no, look, what is it that we're trying to do? And let's be with that, and let's connect that in opposed to having to look a certain way or aspiring to something that is nonsensical, right? Because I remember a guy around the corner from my house, he had this grandiose building, right? And one day I'm driving and I see him pulled up in a Rolls Royce in the front, right? And I'm literally 500 feet from the front door. I wanted to stop the car and bust out all his windows, but he had two hitters in fur coats with guns, protecting his Rolls Royce.
His property.
Right? So I'm saying to myself, wow, look at this. And I still wanted to get out the car and be like, man, do your duty, don't miss. But this thing around how do we now think about that? The absurdity of the moment, right? And now the absurdity gets us further away from the justice condition, right? And now how do we come to grips with that, right? Because in so many ways, people feel like that is the solution. And we have to also deal with the contradiction that also our folks are suffering. We can't run from that, right? And when we think about the suffering, now what is healing in relationship to the suffering, right? And those are completely different messages in opposed to if you do X, then Y will happen, right? I think that's the false trope, right? We got to be real serious about how we're engaging folks. And that's not going to come off smoothly. I really appreciate the work of Miriam Kaba, who talks about, she says, justice is a million different experiments, right? And we have to engage in those millions of experiments that now get us out of thinking that this one way that white Western European capital has told us to be, right?
I want to go with a question from online. I know we'll be a little bit over time, but y'all stay as long as you can. So a person online asked this question. Celebrity Morgan Freeman has said that to end racism, quit talking about it. MLK dreamed of the day where we would judge people by the content of their character. Why should skin color ever enter the conversation? And I'm gonna need y'all to be brief. So be brief so we can get to at least one more question in the audience. Because I know that's a loaded question. That's why I asked.
No, I'm gonna be real brief. I am truly not trying to disinclude folks, but there are some people whose lives are very drastically different than everybody else's. Morgan Freeman's life ain't like my cousin's life, right? And so Morgan Freeman has all the privileges to say, you know, why does race matter? It matters because it always mattered, right? So somebody asked, this is 2020. Somebody asked Lil Wayne, what you think about Black Lives Matter? Like, when did Lil Wayne become?
Right.
So we can hear folks, we can hear things from a whole lot of people, right? And I am not at all saying that their opinions don't matter. But when this is not something that you're steeply knowledgeable about, then just because you're a public figure doesn't give you the authority to provide some form of response that we should all have to listen to. I'm gonna stop right there.
Dr.
Come on,
Moore, I
come
can
on,
tell.
Yeah.
Dr. Moore got something to say.
Come on,
and I
Francis.
know.
I just have one question, just one. And that question is, who benefits from us not talking
That's right.
about issues of race?
That's right.
That's it. That's just the question.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, and we'll take one from the audience. And then we'll-
Hi, thank you to Kroc for holding this great event, Dr. P. Nice to see you. So I'm Deborah. I'm a third-year PhD student here at Kroc in History and Peace Studies. So I always like the discussion on the past. Something you said, Dr. Brooms and Dr. Stovall, about terms and also about education and how education also comes from experience. So my Black American friends always laugh at me when I say, I didn't know I was Black till I landed here.
I don't know why they laughing.
Right, I'm saying, for real.
And once I returned back to Kenya, after doing grad school, I realized racism is in Kenya. All right. So how I even viewed the Kenyan landscape changed. Sometimes my family and friends looked at me crazy. I was seeing things coming around the river bend that I didn't see just from my experience here. So I come back to the US and I just took my comps. So one of my fields was US in the world. Now the other term is US empire. Now, if we say that the US empire was built on what you say is genocide, slavery, land appropriation, and going to Dr. Hewitt's invocation of the fiscal imperative, these are the things maybe upholding capitalism. speaking of the marginalized, they need to be accounted for. It's a revolution that caused this. Does a revolution have to occur to undo it? Because when we talk about revolutions in history, the only revolutions we care about are white ones. Because not too long ago, around that time frame, was the Haitian Revolution. And Michel Trouin has always talked about how it was an event no one could believe. But is that what needs to happen in the United States? That a revolution, because no one has used that word.
Wow, teach.
And does that word scare us? Because all revolutions that we know are attached to violence. But then in aspects of repression, what is violence? Going back to Fanon.
Come on, man.
You know, we were all
So
just
my
taking
question,
French
Right, man, like what, man, what?
so my question I ask is, what next? Is it a revolution? What does a revolution look like? And this may be a question I don't have an answer to. But is that what's needed here? Because I feel like it's just band-aids being
Right.
put on wounds,
Right,
and then it heals, and then it's still bleeding going on elsewhere.
right.
So is that what's needed? And if it's that way, what does it look like? This is a Catholic institution. This is a peace studies institute. I want to be accused
Off top,
of calling
Right.
for, to burn down
Right,
anything. But is that what's needed?
right.
To put it out? Because it's a revolution that brought this.
So,
So is it a revolution that needs to happen to undo it? That's all I have.
Yeah, you did go deep for now on us.
right. But it's the points are very clear, right? And I think the answer is what we fear, right? Yes and yes, right? There's no way possible that you can allow this thing to happen to continually demean you, right? And not do anything, right? And the issue is that, like we learned in Haiti, Cuba, revolutions are bloody, right? And they often take no prisoners, and many of folks who have died have actually died a wrongful death, right? And I think it's important to say that. But if we look at the lesson of Haiti, which is probably the most understudied revolution in the history of the world, right? Especially the Western Hemisphere. Y'all know that Haiti has still been paying France reparations since 1803.
Come on.
Right? So I mean, like, let's just put how much money from 1803 to 2024 has Haiti given to France, right? So now we start to think about that in real time. Now, and I think another lesson that we make a mistake around. When you talk to folks in the Black freedom movement, they didn't talk about that as the victory. They always talked about it as the beginning. Right? And that's the mistake that we make when we engage in history and civil rights and any kind of discussion with young folks. They understood that as the beginning. So according to the history of the world, we are still in it. Right? So this thing around revolutions are imminent. And I think we can learn a lesson from folks who engage in abolition, because abolition says something is unacceptable. Now there is the responsibility to create something different. Right? So we know that prisons work. We know that prisons don't reduce crime. Now, what do you do on the front end to see that no one else ever goes into those places? Right? We have abolished that thing that has brought us disdain and detriment, but now we are willing to create something different. Right? And I think we're in this moment. And look how people have usurped this rhetoric. What do Trump followers refer to themselves as engaging in? A revolution. So now this thing around, and how do they frame it, right? They say this is a revolution. We're no longer engaged into the Washington elite. This is a movement of the people, except your guy's a millionaire who's lost all his money. Right? I mean, just the absurdity of it. But I think this thing around revolutions happen in the myriad of ways. Some are violent. Others call into the consciousness of what's actually happening. Most do both. right? And I think that's the thing that we can't be fearful of and really saying, I mean, because they squatted up. I mean, these folks got plans. If Trump doesn't hit it in November, they got a whole strategy on how to hit the Capitol. They know they got it strategically mapped out. They're good, they're ready, right? And people miss the point and say, well, that's purely aspirational until it happens, right? And I think this is that moment that we're in where I don't see as much despair as there's opportunity, right? But you gotta be willing to engage it, right? We can't run from it, right? It's these spaces to move around and rethink some things, but we have to do it, right? We just can't let it slip away. And I think so the answer to your original question, yes and yes, right?
And I had
that space.
I had two things, but Brother Stovall talked about one of them, which was the multiple revolutions. So and I know we got another hand up. I think another thing that is possible is an implosion, right? That there's such steep investment in increase. I mean, because the other thing we got to look at too is like how much has inequality increased in the past. We can go decade to decade, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And I think that then creates conditions for folks to just mess things up so that it actually, I don't want to say helps because that ain't the right word, but I think an implosion is possible too, because stuff can't keep going at the same way that it literally can't. It literally can't. I mean, we got folks because the pandemic exposed even more of the inequities that many of us chose not to see. So I think about like folks who are unhoused, right? In San Francisco, Seattle, Atlanta, in Cincinnati, right? I mean, so there's unhoused populations everywhere. And so the pandemic exposed it. And now we see that like the rents don't go down. It's like college tuition. Like college tuition don't go down. Oh, we got people paying this amount. We're gonna ask them to pay a little bit more. So I think that another condition I just wanted to mention, I think is that inflection point of implosion, because it literally cannot keep going the same way. The society will not, to the point about young people, it's people who, we had the great resignation. I'm supposed like, man, I ain't going back to work. Right? I mean, it's it's some things that folks are getting to the point that they are no longer willing to tolerate. And it might not necessarily be, revolution. It just may be their unwillingness shuts some stuff down. And then we gonna, just collectively, not me. I ain't benefiting from none of this. We're gonna have to figure out like, how do we fix it? But you can't, right? Because again, when you get material possessions, you ain't just giving them up. And we've created conditions in this country where, that 1%, the gross inequity of that, there's gonna be some folks tearing some stuff up. Not for a revolution, but just out of just righteous, again, Dr. King, righteous anger. So I think implosion is another thing that's an element of this that we've seen, we have what was the one on Wall Street, like about a decade ago? Occupy Wall Street. So we see these different manifestations of it, and I think they, in some ways, can coalesce because we can't keep going down the same path. Thank you. I know you had your hand. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
I thank you for this wonderful, and Dr. Stovall, the baseline of this country built on slavery, genocide, and land expropriation. That's a wonderful. So in the Kroc Institute, where we are now, we have a critical lens that we call intersectionality, that all forms of oppression are connected, and so should also be all forms of struggles for justice and liberation. And this critical lens was embodied by, I come from South Africa, by Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. And that's why he is quoted in one of his quotations, "We know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians." So this critical lens also then explains why South Africa, not an Arab country, has taken the state of Israel to the International Court of Justice, charging it with perpetrating genocide. Racism and settler colonialism is intricately connected. So my question is, to what extent are African Americans linking their struggle for freedom and justice against racial oppression with the struggles of other oppressed communities in the United States, especially that of indigenous Native Americans who experienced settler colonialism and the G word, genocide? Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the most strident and tangible examples, I actually was on a call with him this morning, the work of a guy named Kali Akuno and a group called Cooperation Jackson. And the idea of Cooperation Jackson is that there are access points that folks have in the United States that are land-based. But they were very clear that there would be no engaging of any land-based struggle without indigenous people, right? So they actually engaged the Choctaw Nation around what does it mean to engage in a shared understanding of what has been appropriated, and then what is, and I like how they frame it, it's like, what is revenue and justice beyond the casino, right? And I think that's really important when you talk about indigenous economies and the ways they've been reduced to this kind of casino Vegas model that actually doesn't work outside of a very small grouping of people. When I think about my own work in Chicago and the solidarity that folks have talked about in relationship to Palestine. And I want to say very clearly about Palestine, there's something that my father understands very clearly about Gaza, right? He's always like, oh, the water got cut off, the electricity got cut off, they're bombing hospitals. That is an extermination campaign. We've seen that here, and we just don't call it the same thing, right? So when you look at the lack of access to communities of color, and I'll just use Black communities, to those things, communication, healthcare, employment, housing. Now you have seen the results of a 250-year extermination campaign, depending on where you live, right? And when folks have, this past semester, I had Palestinian students who have family in Gaza and the West Bank. And they were explaining to me something, and it goes back to book banning and the things that we're experiencing here, something that they have in Israel called the Nakba law. This is very important. You cannot teach the forced removal of Palestinians in Israeli schools. Let's just think about that. What does that mean? That the land that you are on, you can have no discussion on how it was reappropriated. And now when we think about that in terms of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Iowa, right? So in the Midwest, we forget how close this is, right? Remember, our first anti-CRT stuff did not come from Iowa, right? It did not come from Texas or Florida. It came from Iowa, right? And then Idaho. What is happening here, right? But this thing back to the point around this understanding of solidarity, those same things now we understand as Black Chicagoans to be true and true all the time. In addition to the surveillance technologies that have been used in Chicago are the same surveillance technologies that have been used in refugee camps in places like Ramallah, Jenin, Gaza City, right? I live in a city where the Chicago Police Department has set up a partnership with the Israeli Defense Force and are trained by the Israeli Defense Force, right? So this thing around really understanding, so the same tactics that are used in places like Jenin, Gaza City, and Ramallah are the same tactics that are used on the south and west sides of the city, right? So now we start to think about the pairing of that, we now are able to understand it very clearly. And people like my father know that very succinctly in terms of what that means, what it looks like, and what comes next. Because as we remember, some folks remember this from Ferguson, and you all here in Peace Studies remember this. Remember, when the protests hit Ferguson, who were the first people to contact Black folks in Ferguson? We missed this story. It's Palestinians, right? Palestinian folks hit people in Ferguson and said, right now, they are in a campaign to contain you. You are about to get tear gas. This is what you need. Make sure that certain people are certain places, and we love you. Right? And that was the first people internationally to hit folks in Ferguson, Missouri were from Gaza. Right? And that thing around really putting that into a different conversation. And many of folks, and I'll just use Chicago as an example, they say it's time to return that debt.
Is there, thank you. Anybody else on the panel want to respond to the solidarity? Okay.
Dr. Hewitt, we just make sure we check with.
All right, okay. All right, well, we're definitely
Okay.
past time, but we have a student, yes.
Okay.
Right?
We got a student
You
question.
got right, you got right.
We got a student.
If you
we got a
ask
student question.
We will take it,
Yes.
and then we will bid be all adieu. But go ahead.
I just have a quick question.
There's a microphone right there.
So I'm a peace studies and psychology person, so I just have a quick question for Dr. Hewitt. Some of the things I'm seeing in the spaces that I am in is this inability of psychology in the mental health field to really discuss and treat racial trauma. In that the DSM or any sort of like psychological tools that we use in our practices and also within our like education system in the psychology field does not really fully address racial trauma or even deal with colonial trauma even. And we're seeing this rise in like racial and ethnic and a lot of violence just reoccurring and continuing, not just once or twice, but like ongoing for years. I would like to argue that the racial trauma that Black people experience in the United States, it has been ongoing and never stopped. But in psychology, we tend to have this perspective on disorder or treatment that there is a beginning and an end, and there's intervals, and there is like moments of reprieve in there, and that's just not true. And so I'm kind of like, I'm kind of like wanting to hear your perspective on this, in that I've never had a psychologist be part of this conversation on racial trauma or racial injustice in any way. But also, I also wanted to add a question for you guys as to this pattern that I'm seeing where we're claiming resistance as violence. This switch of like when the oppressed stand up, it's considered violence. In that we do not want to take into account the context with which it comes from, and also that they are resisting the years-long oppression that they've been facing. And so I'm really curious to hear like how you guys are seeing that show up in your work and in the United States and everything else that's going on too.
Okay, well, we'll let Dr. Hewitt start, and then we'll do your second question, and then this next. And thank you all for staying longer.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I'll be very brief. I really appreciate that question. I wanted to bring in racial trauma. Oh, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to bring racial trauma and healing, but I knew we were going over time. I don't think we can talk about the impacts of racism without talking about the impacts of racial trauma. What I would point you to is Dr. Linda James Myers and reading her optimal theory, which really turns on its head sort of our Eurocentric view and how we define wellness and health. So I'll point you to that, which is an African-centered approach to psychology. And I think it's also important to think about sort of psychological violence. I think the field has shifted. So I'm like maybe 11 years out of my doctorate in psychology. And I will say the field has shifted, at least in documenting the research on the psychological impacts of trauma. But I would agree that the traditional modes of sort of treating sort of behavioral health, mental health, and wellness comes from a place that doesn't really acknowledge sort of other models or paradigms. So I just want to point you to Dr. Linda James Meyer's work. I think you would find it pretty refreshing.
Dr. Gore, you want to start with that next question?
Sure. I'm
So
still
what
trying
about
to sort of
resistance
think
or
about,
reversal?
I'm still sort of trying to think about how I want to answer that. So I think that I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the question is how do individuals who are resisting, how do they deal with sort of the way that their resistance is characterized? Is that right? So in my own work, what I've found is that, and some of the research I've been doing, the stuff I've been doing most recently is I've been talking to white parents who adopt children outside their race. So I've been talking to white parents who have adopted Black children, both internationally and domestic. And the first time I talked to these parents was back in like 2007, 2008, 2009. And I've just recently been able to reestablish contact with these parents. And when I first talked to them, when I first interviewed them, for most of them, their children were very small, like 4 years old, 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And now a lot of time has passed. And so these children are now young adults. And so I've been able to talk to the same parents, right, over time about their experience. What was it like to raise a child of color? And almost every one of them has said to me, I struggled with my child. I'm really concerned about sort of their behavior and sort of the race. When they talk about behavior, they sort of make it into this sort of racial thing. I'm really concerned about the violence associated with their behavior. I'm concerned about the way they speak to me, the way they speak to their, to other white individuals, and they racialize their children's behavior, which is something really interesting to me that I see that I'm beginning to see these sorts of patterns. So in my own work, I'm seeing white parents who desperately love their children, right? They love their children, but the way they define their children's experience, the way they define the way their children react and respond to anti-Blackness, both within the home and outside of the home, is something that is really quite troubling to me. So these children are resisting anti-Blackness and they are punished for it by the people that love them the most, right? By their parents. And so that's something that I'm seeing when it comes to sort of resisting anti-Blackness and sort of the results of doing that. And that's what I'm seeing in my own work right now. And it's something really interesting because it's happening in relations it's happening in very intimate relations where the foundation of that relationship is love. It is love between a parent and a child. And I guess what I'd like to end with is that anti-Blackness is so powerful and racism is so powerful that not even sort of these bonds, these family bonds based in love not even those are untouched by things like anti-racism, right? And I think that that's something that's really important when we talk about the power and the depth of anti-Blackness in particular, I think. So thank you for that question.
And
Hope
allow
that
me
was
just to
helpful.
throw, if I could just throw something in there, Word of God tells us resist the devil and he will flee. We ain't got to fight the devil, right? To resist him. And I think that like when we attach social like a negative anything onto something is to get people to not do it, right? You insist on being racist, that's violence. Me resisting your racism is me getting peace with it as well. And so I think that when we think about resistance, think it as a movement towards peace, that we can't get to just peace if we don't resist injustice. It don't require me to punch you in the throat. right, for it to happen. Doesn't require me to take up arms all the time for that, but there are different ways in which we can resist. That is really important, because if not, then all of your insistence is causing my body harm.
Yep.
Racial violence and insisted on perpetrating it across centuries has caused my body harm. It has caused the social body harm. It has caused the nation harm. That's the part where the violence is. It's the insistence on it, not people trying to resist it. Right?
I think I'm gonna just jump in really, really quick, because I think, to add to what's been said, I think another critical component of this is going back to where we started with the first question around the difficulties in talking about race and racism, is because there are typically people who have a vested interest in how things are named and claimed, right? And so I think about the ways that we will be, if we were really sensitive and empathetic, we would be very careful about how we describe people's behaviors.
Teach.
But because we're really trifling, right? We'll name some things the way that makes us feel better,
Right.
right? So I think about, as Dr. King, just in the spirit, right? And Dr. King said, sometimes when folks respond, the white press might call it a riot. Should I continue to accept these conditions, right? Or should I be quiet? And I'm thinking about it. Audre Lorde says, our silence won't protect us, right? So if we're not standing up and demanding that people treat us as humans, then what did Maya Angelou say? They'll kill you and said you enjoyed it, right? So we had to be real, both mindful and adamant that we name our own. This is an element of CRT, and I didn't even mean to do this, but we got to name our own realities, right? Because if we allow other people to say, well, I'm just thinking about when I was in college, I was called angry Black man because my response did not align with middle-class respectability politics. Because my thing is, like, if you treat me poorly, don't tell me how I need to respond. But if you think about Ferguson, if you think about in the aftermath of Walter Scott in North Charleston, if we think about Sandra Bland, like one of the things that happens very quickly after that is, y'all need to behave a particular type of way.
Right.
Breonna Taylor in Louisville, right? I remember, hey, if you don't, what's the brother, Freddie Gray in Baltimore?
Yeah.
Well, why are these people tearing up their own community? Why y'all tear it up first?
Yeah.
Right? So we not only do we have to be careful, we have to interrogate not just what people say, but why do they name it and phrase things in particular ways? And again, some of that is an investment in either, denying resources or justifying the over-policing, hyper-policing, over-surveillance, right? So that's one thing. And then the second point you made around trauma, I think, is really important too. I'm actually appreciative that there's more conversation about it, right? I'm relatively speaking, right? Because I think that's another thing that people don't really want to deal with. It's not simply, I had this racialized experience. What impact did it have on me psychosocially, right? And so if we're not willing to engage with conversations around that, we ain't willing to even deal with racism, right? Because we always over personalize it. When, again, Chicago, just as that's where I'm from, and I know, Brother Stovall works there, it's like we got people living in West Louisville. I'm thinking about Detroit. I can think about Flint, Michigan. I can think of, a number of places, Southwest Atlanta. We have people living in conditions that are not humane. Like Flint still got dirty water. Let's be clear.
Let's be
right?
clear.
Let's be clear. And connecting to the brother's question, right? I'm thinking about Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, who said, we do not want you to build this pipeline through our ancestral land. And guess who the only people who got arrested? The people who protested the building of the excess pipeline. So people who have access to various forms of power will engage in behaviors because they're backed by those power structures.
And I would love for us to continue this conversation more tonight, but we have got to cut it off. Again, please join me in thanking our esteemed panel, and for all of you who were able to attend on Zoom, and again, for the staff at Kroc for helping us put this together. Thank you all for braving the elements and coming out on tonight. And we had about 53 people online. So glad that people were able to still join in. We unfortunately couldn't get to the many questions online, but that's often what happens. So thank you all. God bless you and have a great and safe weekend. Thank you.
Russell Simmons, thank you all for coming. Thank you all so much. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.